This lecture is the Communication Overview lecture. It covers material from Chapter 1 and also previews some of the material that we will cover later in this semester. One of my big issues that I have to overcome when students come into this class is a lot of times they see Communication 101 and they sign up for it believing that this is going to be one of their cake classes, an easy class. And they find out that actually I'm going to require real work in here and that there's a lot of things that I want to cover and have you to learn. When you come into a medical terminology class, you know that it's going to be tough. And you come in with an open mind that I have a lot to learn. When you come into a Comm 101 class, the obstacle that I have to overcome is that most people believe that they are good communicators. But yet, if you ask those same people, what percentage of people do you believe are good communicators? Many of them will say, 30%. But yet, 80% of people believe that they are good communicators. So there's a difference. Some of you believe that you're good communicators, but others don't believe that you are. So I want you to come into this class with an open mind. Even if you believe you're a good communicator and actually are, the hope is that this class will make you a better communicator. If you're on the other end of things and you believe that you're a poor communicator, I don't want you to be fatalistic. I want you to understand that there are real skills and real things that you can do to improve as a communicator. So come into this class with an anxious and open mind. One of the big goals of this course is to teach the students the complex nature of communication. Communication is not something that's very, very simple. I say something, and then you hear it. We want you to appreciate that there are thousands of ways for communication to go wrong. And we're going to cover these different the complex nature of communication. In your book on page 4, they have a definition for communication. And I won't read that word for word, and you don't need to know it word for word. But I've highlighted a few terms: process, symbols, signs, and behaviors. And big picture on this, we want you to embrace the word process, understanding that communication is something that you do actively engage in and that you do have control of. So you can guide your interactions, make them better, help them to improve. Because communication uses words and uses other things to represent internal thoughts, it can go wrong and be interpreted in a multiple variety of ways. So let's start with some of the functions of communication. Kenneth Burke talked about our desire as human beings to have a connected spine. Right now, many of you are in this classroom or at your home sitting behind your desk, and you are feeling the air conditioning, hearing sounds, thinking your thoughts, having your fears, having your hopes. And we as human beings desire to have other people feel and think and see the world through our eyes. But the problem is we all have separate spines. So Kenneth Burke says that what really makes us most human is that we use communication and words to help other people feel and think as we do. It is our best tool to help us share a spine, to help us to literally reach out and touch other human beings so that we feel a little less isolated in the world. Another function of communication is that communication is there to actually achieve goals. One goal that we have is just to eat, have shelter, have those physical needs met. So one goal of communication is to meet that. I want a cheeseburger. So I go to the drive-thru and I ask for a cheeseburger. I get my food and I meet my goal. Another goal of communication is to express those emotions and feelings that we have, so that we will have a little bit less of a separate spine, and so that we can reach out and touch other people. And we learn this even from a young age. Children are communicating when they cry. They tell us there's something wrong with my world. Please help me. And besides the emotional and the physical elements of communication, we also use communication to connect to the spiritual world. Prayer is something that you send upwards towards heaven. Meditation is something that you do internally. So we use our thoughts and words in order to connect to the spiritual world as well. Another aspect of communication is that we use it to influence others. So that sometimes these other things are kind of about the internal, my physical needs, my spiritual needs, my emotional needs, but we also use it to influence and affect those who are outside of ourselves. In fact, the third speech that you'll be giving in this class is a persuasive speech. And it has at its core the idea of influencing people's beliefs, attitudes, values, and actions. To influence others is another reason why we use communication. Communication is symbolic. Now, your book talks about the fact that communication is symbolic, meaning that the words that we use to describe other things are not connected to the thing itself. And this is important for us to know because many of us have had conversations with somebody where you go like this. I said this. They say, no, you didn't. Yes, I did. No, I didn't. We have to understand that sometimes the thing that we think we've said is not the thing that people have heard. We need to embrace the symbolism of language and understand that the stuff that's in my head is not always what hits your ears. Communication is symbolic, meaning that the word isn't actually connected to the object. Shakespeare sums this thought up when he says that a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. What he means by this is whether you call a rose a poop or you call it a rose, it would still be lovely and beautiful. So who knows, 100 years or 1,000 years from now, teenagers in the world may start calling roses poops and bring them to their girlfriends on Valentine's Day. Here, honey, here's a dozen poops. The word itself will not change the beauty of a rose. Communication is symbolic. Now, I don't have any kids yet, although we do have one on the way. And I have a vision. We just found out she's a baby girl. I have a vision someday that and she might come out and say, Daddy, can I help you? And I'll say, yeah, why don't you go grab me a nut? And then 5, 10, 15 minutes might pass by. And I'll be wondering, where in the world is she? And finally she'll come back outside from the house and she will bring me a nut. Communication is symbolic. The words that we use are not necessarily connected to the object. And in fact, the words can represent a multiple variety of things in people's mind. Communication requires that we have a shared code. This speaks a little towards the idea of a denotative. Denotative meaning denote, starts with a D and connects to dictionary. A denotative meaning for all words, but we also have a connotative meaning for all words. If we were to look in the American Heritage Dictionary, the Webster Dictionary, dictionary.com, etc., we would probably find a fairly consistent definition of the word dad. The word dad in both would probably have something to do with the male gendered parental figure in a family. That's the denotative meaning, the dictionary definition. But the connotative meaning of that word hits your ears in a variety of ways. Connotative is like your personal translation of that, your emotional reaction to the words. So when I say the word dad, for some of you, you literally immediately envision the father who would walk hand in hand with you along the beach, help you to build sand castles. The dad is the person that you would go to whenever times are hard, when you need help, when you need protection. Dad is who you go to. For others of you, when I say the word dad, this is what you think of. You think of the guy who comes home drunk and beats mom. The guy who does nothing but yell at you. That's that connotative meaning. The word dad, male gender, who parents in the home, denotative. Connotative is your emotional and personal reaction to that. We need a shared code. Even with the words that we do have, we need to have some common ground. But even when we have common ground, there's still some variety in our interpretation. Communication is also culturally bound. So that, for instance, if I were on a business meeting in Britain, and I were to ask my potential business partner, would you like to go out and grab a brew? In the United States, if I use the word brew, what am I asking for? Probably a beer. In Britain, if I ask somebody for a brew, they're going to give me tea. United States beer, in Britain, tea. It's culturally bound. The words that we use have multiple interpretations. And we speak in different ways, depending upon what culture we're from. Another characteristic of communication we spoke about earlier was whether it's arbitrary or not. And I do agree that largely communication is arbitrary. But to some degree, I think that it's not arbitrary. What I mean by that is, we'll talk about later the linguistic relativism principle, Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And in this, we're going to talk about the fact that until we have a label for something, we don't even see the thing. So that, for instance, when I was in the Air Force, it was important that we kept our hair in regulations. That, for instance, hair on the side of our head would not touch our ears. So we would regularly go to the barber and ask for them to give us high tights or whatever else so that we could keep our hair in regulations. One time I went with a couple of guys that were in my flight, and they had both gone to high school together. When they went to the barber, they said, give me a high and tight and make sure you clean up the Jonathan. I've never heard this before, and so I asked them, what's Jonathan? They told me that when they were in high school, they used to sit in the back row of class, and they sat right behind a guy who had tons and tons of neck hair, and his name was Jonathan. So they decided that they would start calling neck hair Jonathan. Now that you have a label for it, chances are most of us have not really noticed this otherly type of hair. Not head hair, not back hair, this stuff on the neck. But now that we have a label for it, at some point in time, many of you are going to find somebody that's sitting in front of you and you're going to go, man, they need to clean that Jonathan up. Until you have the word for something, you don't even notice the thing. And because of that, this speaks to the fact that it's not completely arbitrary. As a culture, we label things that we think are important to notice. Some 40 or 50 years ago, when a woman would go out on a date, and a guy would push himself upon her and be too aggressive with her, maybe fondle her or what else, they didn't really have a label for that. Now it's called date rape, sexual assault. And now that there's a label, it changes the way that we see the world. There's now prosecution available because a label exists. Words that we use help us to see the world. All right, another characteristic of communication is whether it's intentional or not. We use a term in the communication circles called ubiquitous. We believe there's a common proverb that we cannot not communicate. You are busy communicating everywhere all the time. And you can never turn that clock off. People are always seeing or viewing communication. So communication does not have to be intentional. On my first day of class last year, I was on my way into school, I was coming up the steps, and I noticed my shoe was untied. So I bent down to tie up my shoe, but just as I was about ready to start tying my shoe, I saw a woman that I'd been in training with a week before come out of the front door. So she said, how are you doing? And I had my head down tying my shoe. I said, oh, I'm doing pretty good. What are you up to? I said, oh, I'm just on my way into class, my first day of classes, I'm a little nervous, hope that things go well. And then I lifted my head up. She wasn't talking to me at all. She was actually on a cell phone. Communication is everywhere, all the time. My friend down in California is one of these guys who believes that he's every girl's dream. And so there's been times where we've gone out to maybe have a drink together, and when we do, he'll see a woman that's in the bar and he'll go, oh man, she is totally checking me out. I'll be like, what are you talking about? She's got her back turned to you, she's playing darts, she doesn't even know you exist. But to him, she is communicating a message that she wants him. Communication is everywhere all the time. In your book, also, they use the term transactional for this next characteristic of communication, and I want to avoid that label. Instead, we're going to use the label contextual. In your book, they use the example of Mel Gibson, who a few years ago got into trouble because he had used some Jewish slurs when he was arrested by the cops. And they talk about the fact that that message of racism was couched in the fact that he had just recently made a movie, Passion of the Christ, where many Jewish people had reacted against that because it showed them in a negative light. And now he comes out with racist comments, and it becomes a big issue. And then later he issues an apology. So all three of these statements are read in the context in which they're originally given. So as another example, communication is contextual. Imagine, if you will, that you've been dating some guy for the past 8 months and you think he's the perfect guy. He's the one for you. So you decide that tonight's the night. You're going to tell him that you love him. So you make a nice romantic dinner, candlelight, steak, potatoes, and you have him come over. You all eat your dinner, have a great time, romantic music playing in the background, and then you stop. And for the first time, you say, I love you. Communication is contextual. That makes a marked moment. It's set aside as something different. Now, the person that you'd be dating, they're going to react to that. If they're very, very excited and also in love with you, they may say, I'm so glad. I've been wanting to tell you for the past month that I'm in love with you. Or perhaps they'll be like, oh my goodness, I've got to get out of this relationship. Communication is contextual. When you say those words, I love you, for the first time, it marks a moment. But let's imagine that you're 43 years down the road on vacation in Hawaii with your wife in a hammock by a beachside. And you lean over and you tell her for the 2,000th or 3,000th time, honey, I love you. Is she going to freak out and be like, oh my goodness, I'm so glad to hear this. It's been 43 years and I was starting to worry you didn't anymore? Probably not. It doesn't mark the moment in the same way. So the same words are couched in their context. Communication is contextual. Also, we've already talked about this a little bit in the definition, that communication is a process. And we want you to realize that you are actually mindfully and actively engaged in something that you can help to influence on whether the communication is going to go well or poorly. Communication must be appropriate and effective. Appropriate and effective. So imagine a scenario in which a student comes up to me in a couple of weeks and says, Johnny, I'm so sorry that I'm late on that assignment. I just couldn't get it finished. I couldn't concentrate. My grandfather died this weekend. So let's imagine that that's what they've said. If I say, okay, I can give you an extension on that assignment, and that's what they were here to do, is to get an extension, then communication would have been effective for them. If their grandfather actually did die, it would also be appropriate. But let's imagine that same scenario, but this time, the grandfather didn't really die, they just told me that he died. If I give the extension, it's still effective, but it's no longer appropriate. Same scenario. Let's imagine you say, I just couldn't concentrate, Grandpa died. And I say to you, I'm so sorry to hear this. It's not easy to lose a relative, but I don't give extensions in this class. If Grandpa really did die, it would be appropriate. But because I didn't give the extension, it wouldn't be effective. Same scenario. Let's imagine that you lied and I didn't give the extension. It would then be ineffective and inappropriate. It's 4 different scenarios. We want you to be mindful how you communicate. And we want you to live in a world where you're effective and appropriate most of the time. Communication requires skills. So we're going to teach you some of the skills in this class. Teach you how to better communicate. So you need to embrace the learning in this class. All right, so let's look at some of the communication models. In your textbook, there are several different models that are shared. One is this linear model. And the linear model is sender-focused. It's about how I craft the message and deliver it to you. That's why I've used a satellite dish as the analogy here. The satellite dish just sits there and waits for the satellite from space to send a signal. It's all about the sender to a passive receiver. Under this model, if this lecture was totally bad, The blame is with me. I'm the sender, and it's all about how I craft the message and send it out. That's the linear model, sender focus. Another model of communication is the turn-taking model. I've used the cell phone as an analogy here. On that, it's not just about a sender, it's also about you. It adds a feedback or a turn-taking loop. So I send and you send. I send and you send. We take turns. And texting is often like that. I will send a text, you'll see it and answer it and send something back. So we're both functioning as senders in this communication, taking turns. Another model of communication is the transactional model. This is why I didn't want you to adopt the transactional label earlier in this lecture. Transactional talks about the fact that you and I are actually simultaneously exchanging information. So that when I'm lecturing and a student starts to nod their head and fall asleep, I say to myself, okay, I better do something to spice this thing up a little bit. Or if students are engaged, eyes up, heads nodding, that tells me, okay, they're probably interested in this section and we're doing okay. So we're actually simultaneously communicating, even in a public speaking situation. I'm sending messages and you're responding with yours. And I use Skype, video teleconferencing, as the analogy here. That actually, while you're talking through video teleconferencing, you're still seeing the person on the other end. And they may be doing something like this, meaning I gotta get going. Or they're nodding their head, kind of letting you know. So you get the nonverbal signals at the same point in time while you're sending it out. It's transactional, simultaneous exchange of information. In this class, we're going to survey communication in several different contexts. We're going to talk about intrapersonal communication, the stuff that you tell yourself. Interpersonal communication, the way that you react and interact with other people. Small group communication, the way that a multitude of people come together to interact. Public communication, when you're talking to several people and giving a message. Mass communication, when you talk about communication through newspapers, magazines, those kinds of things. And organizational communication. The way that even something as simple as a organizational chart sends a message and conveys where the source of power is in an organization. There are other contexts of communication that we won't survey in here. Health communication, intercultural communication, and gender communication are just a few. We'll touch upon them briefly within the context of other contexts of communication, but we won't explore those in depth. And this concludes our communication overview lecture.